What's up guys, it's Brad from Light Architect here. Today I'm going to be showing you how you can build larger scale explosion simulations inside of Blender utilizing some Khaos add-on operators and mantaflow. This should be a fairly quick tutorial going through some basic concepts that you can apply to some various fire and smoke explosions you can create inside of Blender. Anyways guys, let's get started. Here we are inside of Blender. Of course, the first thing we are going to do is just delete everything in our scene so that we have a clean slate to work with. Then I'm going to just go to our Khaos tab here, and as I've done before, I'm just going to scroll down here to our collision objects, and we're just going to add a collision cube to the scene. And as I've said before, this collision cube will bounce off both particles and will interact with the smoke that will be simulated in our scene. If you want to add other objects that will interact with smoke and particle systems as well, then you would just add that object to your scene, select it, and then enable the fluid collision options as well as the collision physics here for the particle systems. Anyways guys, I'm going to just go ahead and scale down our cube on the Z-axis so that we can create a nice little ground plane for our explosion. And it's just nice to have a little bit of an environment to interact with our particles, just so the explosion simulation has a little bit more of an organic look. A lot of the time it's nice to have a base to our environment just so our explosion is a little bit more organic in our scene. Alright, so now let's go ahead and get to adding our fuel particle systems with some Khaos operators here. So I'll go ahead and go to the Khaos tab here, and we're going to be using the dynamic smoke fire operator at first. We'll be using the omnidirectional burst operator at first as well, but we're going to go ahead and adjust a few Khaos particle parameters. We will increase the particle amount by say 10. Then we'll go ahead and scale the particle life by 2 for this first operator. And we'll go ahead and make the particle start size 1 as well. Then we'll go ahead and change the starting and ending velocity down to 0.1. And the reason we're doing this is because for a larger scale smoke look, sometimes the smoke doesn't have to move as quickly. Sometimes you have that kind of dense smoke that's moving a little bit slower. It's not always the case, but just something that I've experimented with. I've noticed that a lot of the time for these larger scale simulations, the smoke, at least in appearance, seems to move a little bit slower. So by decreasing the smoke's velocity with these parameters, we can achieve that look a little bit better. But just keep in mind that you can experiment with different options yourself. And this is pretty good for now, so I'll go ahead and choose a frame on our timeline that we want to add our explosion to. So I'll go ahead and go to frame 24 maybe. And then as usual, I will select our 3D cursor where we want to add the explosion. So I'll go ahead and select in the middle of our scene here just for now. And then I'll go ahead and click on the omnidirectional burst operator. And now as you can see, we have a custom domain cube with the Khaos fire shader in it and our omnidirectional burst operator here in the middle. And we'll just bring this up so it's above our ground plane here, and then we'll just scale our smoke domain around our object here. And I'll just put it up here for now and see what we're getting. And I'll go ahead and select our omnidirectional burst operator, and we're just going to create the base of our explosion with this operator. So I'll go ahead and just play through it here. And it's looking pretty good actually so far. I'm going to go ahead and go to the particle settings and just adjust a few things. So I'll go ahead, I want to change the viewport display to display as cross. And now we can just kind of see what our particles are doing a bit better. I'll also go ahead and change the end frame of our particle emission time to 27 instead. So we have a little bit different look. And one thing I've noticed in larger scale explosion simulations is that a lot of the times the particles tend to last a little bit longer in the scene. So what we might do is we might increase the lifetime of our particles a bit just to get that larger scale look. For example, if our explosion is much smaller, we might decrease the lifetime to something like 2, and then we just have an explosion that's a very short duration. As you can see here if we play through it. And that would work for a smaller scale explosion simulation, but since we're going for something larger in scale, we'll just increase the lifetime a little bit. And I think 8 is pretty good for the base of our explosion, but we'll just try something like 9 just for the sake of this tutorial. We'll go ahead and leave it like this for now, and we'll also just scale up our domain cube a little bit, just so we have a little bit more to work with. And I also might select our particle system here, and I might change the lifetime randomness down to 0, just so the particles die off at the same time. Maybe not quite 0, maybe something like 0.6. And we'll also increase the number of our particles to 2000. Alright, so this should be a pretty nice base of our explosion here. Now what we're going to do is add a few more Khaos operators to shape our explosion a little bit more uniquely. We'll go ahead and keep using the dynamic smoke fire operator at first, and then we'll go ahead and select the 360 ground burst operator, go back to frame 24 where our explosion starts, and I'll go ahead and add a 360 ground burst operator here. And now what we can do here is we can scale our 360 ground burst operator up on the z-axis to get particles going more where we want them. So essentially wherever our 360 ground burst operator is pointing, that's where the particles are going to go more. So you can have a lot of control over this operator just by scaling it on the z-axis and changing the spread of those particles. So I'll go ahead and just play through it here, see what we're getting so far. And essentially what we're doing is we're just finding ways to add fuel and variation in our explosion here. So I'll go ahead and also change the viewport display of this particle system to cross as well, so we can just see the density of our fuel field. And we'll change the lifetime of this specific one to something like, we'll try 10 for this one, so it's a little bit longer in life. And we'll just scale it up on the z-axis a little bit, and we'll just start placing this to kind of create some more shape in the explosion. That should be pretty good. And now what we might do is we can just press Shift D and duplicate this particle system. And then under the particle tab, we'll just go ahead and copy the particle system as well. And then we'll just rotate it around and we'll start blasting out fuel particles in another direction. This might be pretty nice. And we'll also change the lifetime of this to maybe 11, just to give it a little more variation. We'll play through it again here. And I'll put this one blasting a little bit more upwards. That's looking pretty good. We might change the scale on the z-axis a little bit to give it a little more variation. And I'll go ahead and duplicate this 360 ground burst one more time. So we'll go ahead and press Shift D, and then again we'll duplicate the particle system in the particle tab here. And I'll just rotate this down, and I'll go ahead and put this one off to the side here. Maybe change the lifetime to, we'll do one more frame, we'll put it at 12, and we'll kind of play through it here, see what we're getting. That's kind of cool. It's a little bit too much over on the right side here, so we'll just rotate it around, and we might put it so it's blasting over here. So we'll just rotate it, see what this does for us. This is looking kind of cool. It's a nice little variation in our particle system. So now let's go ahead and we'll add one more 360 ground burst operator, but we'll do this one a little bit later in our scene, like it's some kind of secondary explosion. So we'll go ahead and go back to frame 24 here, and we'll go a few more frames to somewhere like, we will try something like 28 or 27. And I'll go ahead and keep the dynamic smoke fire operator selected, and then I'll go ahead and press on the 360 ground burst operator again. And now I'll go ahead and decrease the number of particles for this one to maybe something like 500. I'll increase the lifetime randomness as well, and I'm just going to play through it here really quick. And for this 360 ground burst, we're going to leave it kind of flat like it comes into our scene, so it's a little bit more distributed and not quite as directional. And we'll just place it in the center here, but we'll increase the lifetime of these particles a lot, kind of like they're tracer debris particles that are going to create little streaks in the explosion here. So we'll go ahead and increase the lifetime of this to something like 13 or 14 maybe. It's going to kind of create some streaks in our blast, as you can see here. Might be kind of cool. Maybe even increase it one more frame to a lifetime of 15. And this is kind of cool. I might go ahead and press Shift D and duplicate this particle system one more time. And then I'll increase the number of these particles to something like 2,000. And we'll also, in addition to these tracer particles, we'll go ahead and add another secondary gasoline explosion as well. So I'll go ahead and duplicate this particle system, and then just kind of put this in our scene as a secondary gasoline type fuel field. And we'll just kind of put this out here, rotate it up. Maybe we want this one blasting directly up. Might be a cool look. And we'll go ahead and go to the viewport display of this one as well and change it to cross. And this one's just kind of positioned so it blasts directly up. We might go ahead and increase the lifetime of this one a little as well to something like 16. And again, that longer particle lifetime is going to create a slightly larger scale look. And something like this is kind of cool. And I'll go ahead and select our other 360 ground burst here, and we'll just change the viewport display to cross as well and see what we're getting here. And this is looking kind of cool. As you can see, we're just shaping our explosion a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and scale down the tracer particles a little bit on the z-axis. So I'll just scale this one down a little bit like this. Or actually, maybe I'll scale it up on the z-axis so it blasts more upwards. Let's try this. And for this particle system, I'm going to go ahead and blast it a little bit more upwards. Upwards to the left, I think. And essentially all we're doing here, guys, as I said before, is just building out our fuel field for our explosion to kind of shape the initial blast. So the last thing I'm going to add is just a quick dust wave type effect on the bottom here. So I'll go ahead and deselect the smoke fire option in our Khaos tab, and I'll go ahead and instead I'll select dynamic smoke, and then I'll go back to frame 24 and add a 360 ground burst operator. And this is just going to be a smoke dust wave type look. So I'll go ahead and I'll scale this one down, way down on the z-axis, so it'll blast the particles straight out to the side here. As you can see, if we play through it here, it's just going to blast out particles directly out from the side, and then we'll just place this one down by the base of our explosion, and that's just going to create that dust wave look. Alright, something like this should be pretty good. I'll increase the number of particles to 2,000 since we don't have a lot of particles down by the bottom here, and then I'll change our display mode to cross. Then I'll change the lifetime of this one as well to something like 14. And let's go ahead and play through it here again. Now, as you can see, we have a nice little dust wave particle system going on here, which I think is going to be a nice little effect to add. And I think this should be pretty good. Maybe I'll increase the number of particles in our dust wave explosion a little bit to 3,000. And now let's go ahead and I'll increase the size of our ground base here. So I'll just increase the scale on the z-axis a little bit, as well as the y-axis, just so we have a little bit wider base to work from. Let's see here. Now we just need to make sure that the domain cube is going to cover our explosion pretty well. I think this should be pretty good. We might even decrease the size of it on the z-axis a little bit to get a little bit more detail out of our domain cube. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and save our project here really quick. And I'll just name a new folder here. We'll call it Large Scale Explosion Tutorial. We'll go ahead and close our Khaos tab here, and we'll select our smoke domain, and we'll go to the smoke domain settings here. And in addition to the particle lifetimes, one of the main things that affects the look of your explosion and that large scale look is the resolution divisions here. And a lot of the times it serves us well to get a larger scale look to increase the resolutions divisions quite a bit. And what that's going to do is it's just going to increase the number of voxels, or kind of the way our smoke domain is divided up and the amount of detail in there, to create a little bit more initial detail in our initial smoke domain mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the resolution divisions to something like, we'll try something like 320, and that's going to give us a little bit larger scale of a look. How detailed these resolution divisions make your explosion is dependent on the size of your domain cube as well. So if your smoke domain is way too big and your particle system, fuel systems are very small, then it's not going to give you enough detail. So you want to make sure that your smoke domain is just big enough to surround your explosion simulation, so you're getting as much detail as possible with the least amount of memory being used by your computer. Anyways, let's go ahead and I'll go ahead and adjust a few of the domain settings here. I'm going to go to the fire setting really quick here, a little bit slower to give us a little bit more of a gasoline style look. If you left it at 0.75, that's totally fine too. It's just keep in mind that the fuel field is going to burn off a little bit faster, so you won't have those lingering flames quite as much. And under the smoke option, I'll just change the vorticity to something like 0.05. And that's just going to make the smoke have a little bit less of like that ink drop effect with mantaflow, and it's just going to break it up a little bit more. And you could also add turbulence with the turbulence operator here, or your own turbulence field, but for this tutorial we're going to leave that out for now, as I think we can get a pretty good result without it by just increasing the vorticity a little bit. And now I'll just go ahead and under the cache option we'll select a place for our smoke cache to be saved. So I'll go ahead and choose that same folder and create a new one called Large Scale Cache, and we'll just select it here and accept, and that's where all of your smoke simulation data is going to be saved. And then we'll just choose the end frame of our simulation here as well. So we'll go about 4 seconds as usual, so maybe something like 124. Since our explosion starts at frame 24, that'll be about 4 seconds. If you have any glitches with the adaptive domain option, be sure to deselect this and try again. I'm going to go ahead and leave it on for now, but just keep in mind if you're having any glitches in your smoke domain, it's probably because of that. So you might want to deselect it and try again. But anyways, I'll save our project one more time, and then we'll go ahead and press bake data, and then give your computer some time to simulate your original base mesh before we bake that high resolution noise on top of it. Alright guys, so we are back and this is the base of our explosion simulation. I'd say it's looking pretty cool here. I think if I were to bake this again, the one thing I would change is I would just increase the number of particles being blasted out on each fuel particle system just to get rid of a few of the streaks here. But I think regardless, this is going to be a really awesome result once we bake this with some high resolution noise on top of it. But as usual, we're just going to preview it here really quickly through the OpenGL render active viewport option just to make sure that we like what we're getting in real time. So I'll just go ahead and change the output mode % resolution to something like 65, and then I'll just go to view and viewport render animation, and now Blender is just going to go through our explosion simulation frame by frame so that we can play it back to see what we're getting in real time. We'll go ahead and close this here and make sure you change the end frame of your animation to the end frame of your simulation. So we'll change this to 124. And now we'll go ahead and go to render and view animation, and now we can see it play in real time, and I'd say it's looking pretty awesome. There's a nice little gasoline just burning off here at the end. I might have decreased the flame rate a little bit more in this case just to get a little more lingering flames, but I think this is going to look really awesome as well. So let's go ahead and close this and bake that high resolution noise on top of our original base mesh. So we'll go ahead and select the smoke domain here, and then we'll just go to the physics options here under the smoke domain, and we'll go ahead and select the noise option here. And depending on how much detail you want to add to your original simulation, you may want to increase the up-res factor a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and leave it at 2 for this specific example, as we already baked it at 320 grid resolution and the camera's not going to be that close when we're rendering it. So I'll go ahead and leave it at up-res factor at 2, and then I'll go ahead and save my project one more time. And then we'll go ahead and press bake noise, and then once again give your computer some time to bake that noise on top of your original base mesh. Alright guys, so we are back and we have baked the high resolution noise on top of our original smoke simulation. As you can see here, that high resolution detail really carved up our smoke and fire, and it's looking really awesome here. So now let's get to tweaking our materials a little bit and then lighting and exporting our explosion with an alpha channel. Before we adjust our material settings, let's go ahead and add a light to our scene and adjust a few of the scene settings here for a more optimal rendering environment. So first we'll go ahead and choose a good angle for our simulation and then add a camera. So I'll go ahead and press Shift A and I'll add a camera to our scene, and I'll just drag this one back, and something like this is probably pretty good. Let's go ahead and view through the camera here really quick and just rotate this around. Something like this should look pretty good. Now let's go ahead and press Shift A and we'll add an area light to our scene. We'll just place this first one off to the right of our explosion. Just rotate it and scale it up a little bit to make a larger source. And then we'll go to the light property setting here, and I'll just increase the power to something like 10,000. And then I'll go ahead and press Shift D, duplicate this area light, and we'll put one more on the right side of our blast here. And this should work for now to get a general idea of what we're looking at. And I'll go ahead and go to the environment settings here as well, and then I'll add a sky texture, and that's just so we can have some ambient lighting in our scene. I'll increase the strength to 1.4, and we'll leave it at that for now. Then we'll go to the camera settings here, and under the light paths we'll increase the volume bounces to 5, and that's just going to help the light bounce around the smoke a little bit more, and it's going to give a much more realistic result. The higher this number is, the more realistic it's going to look. Of course, it's also going to take more time the higher you put this number as well, but I think 5 should be pretty good. Then we'll go ahead and go to the volumes tab here, and we'll decrease the step size to 0.05, and then we'll increase the max steps to 260. And that should be pretty good for now. Let's go ahead and go to the shading tab here. And right now we're rendering in EV mode, so let's go ahead and switch to cycles here and make sure under the render engine we've also selected cycles here as well. And then we'll also go to the film tab here and change the background to transparent so that we can render this with an alpha channel. And now let's go ahead and go to view, viewpoint camera, and let's see what we're getting so far. And I'll go ahead and select our ground plane here, and I'll go ahead and go back to solid mode here really quick. And we'll go ahead and select our ground plane here and just increase the size on the x-axis, and then we'll also increase the size of it on the y-axis as well. And this is so we can make our ground plane a shadow catcher so that we can composite it on top of whatever background we want with only the explosion and the shadows from the explosion on the ground plane. And now let's go ahead and go under the object properties tab while our ground plane is selected, and then under the visibility settings we'll change this object to a shadow catcher, and now this plane is only going to render shadows in our scene. And now let's go ahead and adjust our materials for our scene. So we'll go ahead and select the smoke domain here, and as you can see we have our Khaos fire shader with some preset settings here, which might be pretty good, but let's go ahead and adjust a few here just to see what we're getting. I'll go ahead and go to rendered view here. And as you can see here, there's a lot of really good detail in the smoke and fire, but let's go ahead and adjust a few of the material settings just to get a little bit different looking result. I've noticed that a lot of the time when we increase the smoke contrast, we get a slightly larger scale look of the explosion. So we'll go ahead and increase this to 4. And then we'll also increase the flames brightness to maybe 10, just to get a little bit brighter flames in our scene here. And as you probably know, we can also change the colors of the flames through the smoke fire color ramp, as well as the smoke color in the Khaos fire shader. I'm going to go ahead and change the smoke color to something slightly darker. And then what we're going to do is we're going to increase the brightness to something slightly darker. And then what we're going to do is we're going to increase the brightness of our area lights here as well. So I'll go ahead and go back to solid mode really quick. And this is just a matter of trial and error to see what you guys like. I might just add one more light to our scene here, since both of these are kind of edging our explosion. I'll just go ahead and duplicate one of these area lights one more time, and I'll just put this in front of the explosion going straight down at it to give it a little bit of a front light. And we'll see what this is getting for us now. So I'm going to go ahead and increase the brightness of that area light a little bit to something like 20,000. And then we might actually bring the smoke contrast down a little bit to 3, and then bring the flames brightness down as well to something like 7. And if we zoom in here pretty close and let it render out here for a second, we can see that there's a lot of nice detail in our fire as well as our smoke explosion here, and it's going to look really awesome when we render it out. I think this is going to look pretty good, so I'll go ahead and go back to solid mode, and I think this is going to look really nice, but feel free to adjust any of these settings in the Khaos fire shader as you prefer. If you want a more wispy explosion, you would decrease the density or contrast, and then you would also decrease the flames brightness as well. And also you might want to keyframe some of these values. For example, near the beginning of the explosion, if it's a little bit too bright, you might want to decrease the flame brightness at that point and then increase it near the end of the explosion when the flames are burning off. But a lot of the time you don't have to do that, but just keep that in mind that it is possible to keyframe some of these settings if your explosion looks a little bit too bright or too dark at different parts of your explosion. And so let's go ahead and go back to layout mode here, and I'll go ahead and prepare our explosion for export and then do a test render. So I'll go ahead and I'll select our camera here, and I'll go to the camera tab here, and we'll change the render samples to something like 36 for now. And depending on the quality of your explosion and how much detail you want, you might want to increase this value, but I found a lot of the time a number around 40 works pretty well, especially for smoke. So we're going to go ahead and leave it there for now. Under the advanced settings, I'll also check the seed stopwatch for some noise variation, and then we'll scroll down here. Again, we have our volume bounces at 5. I might increase that to 6 for the render, and this is looking pretty good. We'll go ahead and we'll go to output properties. We'll go ahead and increase the resolution percent to 100%, and at 1920 by 1080 resolution we'll increase the percentage to 100. And then here's where we can change our output folder for the explosion file. So I'll go ahead and choose a folder here, and then I'll just create a folder for it there, and this will be our beauty pass output. And we'll also go ahead and change the file format to OpenEXR, and make sure that you have RGBA for your alpha channel as well. We'll go to the layer properties tab here, and under the passes settings here, we'll go ahead and select the emission pass option, and then we'll go under the compositing tab. We'll go ahead and select use nodes, and then we'll go ahead and press Shift A and output a file output for our emission pass. And this is so we can composite the flames separately in whatever compositor we want with that glow and glare more effectively. And I'll go ahead and choose a new folder here for it. I'll call this large scale explosion. And that should be pretty good for now. And now let's go ahead and do our test render. So I'll go ahead and go to render and render image, and then give your computer a little bit of time to render out this image. Alright, so we have rendered out our test render, and it's looking really awesome here. I'm pretty happy with this result. There are a few things I might change in our initial simulation. I might have decreased the domain resolution just slightly to prevent a little bit of these streaky particles here. Another thing I could have done to prevent that is just increase the general amount of the particles so that they overlapped a little bit more and you don't see the individual aspects of them. But I think it's looking really awesome here. There's a lot of really good detail in our smoke and fire, so I'm going to go ahead and export the final animation from here. Before we end this video, I just want to mention one more time the importance of adding glow and glare to your final composite. This is going to really make your explosion way better inside of whatever scene you're adding it to, so just keep in mind that the compositing of your explosion is incredibly important when it comes to getting that realistic look. So I've just done a little quick compositing setup here, and all I did here, guys, is I just added a gray background, but then I just added a bunch of different fog glow settings on our emission pass, and then I overlaid that emission pass with the glow on top of our beauty pass of the explosion. And as you can see, it's really bringing it together a little bit. I could obviously tweak this some more, and I'll end up exporting this into After Effects and adding different glow settings as well. But as you can see here, it's definitely looking much better in our scene once we add that glow to the simulation. So just keep it in mind that compositing is so incredibly important. I can't state that enough. So to export this animation so that you can composite in your visual effects compositor of your choice, you would just make sure that the frames included in your timeline are the ones that you want rendered, and then you would just go to render and render animation. And then once again, you would just give your computer some time to render out all of your frames. I usually do this overnight, since sometimes volumetric rendering can take a little while, but again, it totally depends on your scene setup and how close your camera is to your explosion. Anyways guys, that's it for this video. I hope it was helpful. As always, feel free to leave any comments if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. We will be releasing more videos every week showing you how to create more explosions inside of Blender utilizing the Khaos presets, so I hope you find them useful. I'll see you guys next time.